So, it's a business story with a meteoric rise to the top and a disastrous fall to the bottom, with lots of wealth, fame, and drama along the way. Plus, a very eccentric CEO. But in true Delorean style, to make sense of all of this, we need to travel back in time. Our story starts in the 1920s in Detroit, Michigan, the mecca of America's auto industry and home of the Big Three: Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. All proudly made their vehicles in the city that once employed 1 in every 5 people living in Michigan. It was also here that an automotive genius, John Delorean, was born. His father, a Romanian immigrant, worked as a union organizer for the Ford Motor Company, but his poor English skills and lack of education restricted him from gaining a higher position in the business. Whereas from a young age, John Delorean showed great interests in technology and excelled at his studies. He got accepted into the Lawrence Institute of Technology, where he turned his attention to industrial engineering. His future looked bright, but his personal life was getting dark. During this time, John's parents got divorced, and his father would become a reclusive drug addict. John was then drafted to fight in World War II and served 3 years in the army. After all this, John realized that although he wanted to pursue engineering, his family needed help, since they were in very poor living conditions. Thus, John got a job selling life insurance and gained a lot of communication skills here that helped him become a great salesman. John grew bored in the job though, and eventually an opportunity came up for a postgraduate program run by the Chrysler Institute for automotive engineers. After graduating from the program, John was able to join the engineering team of Chrysler, which he then leveraged into getting an even better job at General Motors. Initially working in their Pontiac division, John worked hard, and soon he was able to work up to the position of chief engineer for Pontiac. When he was put in charge of Pontiac, Delorean decided that America should have their own version of a powerful sports car, and he led the development of the Pontiac GTO. This was a risk, as the heads of General Motors weren't impressed by the idea and didn't see the point, since they already had powerful fast cars like the Camaro and Corvette. But John backed himself, and it paid off. The public loved it, and John got promoted to the head of the Pontiac division, making him the youngest division head at GM at only 40 years old. John continued making improvements to the GTO, which helped start America's muscle car era. However, John wanted to make a powerful luxury car. The problem was Pontiac didn't have the funds for it. So John sweet-talked his boss to transfer some funds from another division over to the Pontiac team. And before long, John had led the development of the Pontiac 1969 Grand Prix car. Once again, John had taken a risk on a car that many executives didn't think was a good idea. But once again, sales numbers were great, and John had helped boost the brand's reputation. John Delorean quickly became a household name as he started showing up in magazines, televised interviews, and big car events. His image was also of great help, as he was almost the complete opposite of the other Detroit automotive heads. While they were all elderly men who dressed in black suits with ties, Delorean was younger, had long brushed hair, and wore sneakers and open-button shirts. He did things differently and was very charismatic, and thus, he started developing an image as a bit of a maverick. GM knew they had a rock star on their hands, and if he could become the face of their development team, then it would help boost sales even further. So, GM once again promoted John Delorean and made him the head of their most prized division, Chevrolet. Now, GM was the largest car company in the world at the time, so John was of course thrilled to be rising up the ranks so quickly. However, this promotion couldn't have come at a worse moment. Chevrolet was going through a very rough patch, as they were completely behind schedule with their production and facing massive delays, which was allowing competitors to dominate instead. However, John managed to turn things around for Chevrolet, as he managed to speed up production by simplifying the car designs, as well as lowering assembly costs and improving Chevrolet's reputation. In truth, John's public image helped as well, As his cool persona continued to grow, because John was one of the first corporate leaders of the time to be publicly living such an exciting life. Before long, John was promoted to vice president of General Motors, and many thought he would eventually become president of the whole company. But this scared GM's executives. John's eccentricity and unusual style was very unpredictable. He didn't always do what he was supposed to, and some executives felt his seemingly rock and roll lifestyle didn't give the company the kind of stability an organization like GM needed, and thus, they began fighting with John over his ideas for the future of GM. Long story short, GM lost patience with him and forced him out of the company. For half a century, America didn't really have any new car manufacturers because to compete with the Big Three was crazy. But John Delorean perhaps was a little crazy, so he made the risky decision to start his own car company. With his star power and vast automotive industry connections, in 1973, John created the Delorean Motor Company, or DMC as it was known. And John wanted the first DMC car to be a sports car built from the ground up, something that could show the world what he could have accomplished at GM if it wasn't for other executives interfering and restricting him, something that represented the future. To do this, John recruited Lotus founder Colin Chapman to design the chassis, and Delorean designed the body, along with Giorgetto Giugiaro, who designed cars for Ferrari and Alfa Romeo. John also poached some engineers from GM. Together, they came up with a futuristic-looking sports car that would come with gull-wing doors, a rear engine, and be made with stainless steel. At the time, many European sports cars were vulnerable to rust since they used thin metals to keep the weight of the car light. But stainless steel doesn't rust as easily, so it not only gave the car a shiny futuristic look, it also helped protect the car against bad weather. After assembling the right team and using his automotive contacts to get the different parts he needed, such as an engine that could offer his car the speed and power he wanted, the DMC DeLorean was born as a concept car, which John called the DMC-12. John was a smart salesman and managed to use his network to raise money by selling investors on his vision for the company. However, to build a manufacturing plant required even more money than he could raise from individual investors, and so he really needed the support of a government. But the USA, Germany, Italy, and Japan, who were all automotive giants, didn't seem to be interested in supporting DeLorean's new company, as they didn't think it would be able to compete with its bigger rivals. So John looked at countries that were going through a rough time and desperately needed employment, as perhaps they would give him government grants in return for creating jobs. And there was just one country that was willing to give DeLorean the money, and that was Northern Ireland. The only problem was that meant he'd have to build his business in a war zone. From the late 1960s to the late 1990s, Ireland had gone through a violent conflict which became known as the Troubles. Unsurprisingly, not many businesses were looking to invest in the country with all of this going on, and thus unemployment in Northern Ireland was very high. Enter John DeLorean with his plan to create a new car company that could create lots of jobs and help the economy. Since the UK government was desperate to try and create some peace between the Protestant and Catholics and help tackle rising unemployment, they decided to give grants to John DeLorean to help him build a car factory in Northern Ireland in the city of Belfast. John DeLorean later commented that literally no other country would give him any funding, as they didn't think his company would survive. But since no new companies really wanted to go to Northern Ireland at the time, with all the riots and fighting going on, Northern Ireland was as desperate for jobs as John was desperate for funding, so the deal worked for both sides. And, despite all the violence and hate going on outside, the DeLorean factory became a peaceful common ground between the Catholic and Protestant workers. Whilst they fought each in the streets, inside the factory they worked side by side. And together, the Irish workers were able to get the first DeLorean off the line in 1981. Finally, John DeLorean proved to the world that it was possible to start up a car company from scratch and deliver a car that looked like it came from another world. Unfortunately, the story of DeLorean is not a success story. For starters, the DMC-12 was an American car with an Italian design, a mostly French engine, and was built in a factory where none of the workers had any previous car-making experience. Besides, these cars was expensive, alongside weak engine. Plus, in 1981, the economy tanked, and nobody was willing to spend an exuberant amount of money on a sports car anyway. Not only did the economy damage the car industry, it also allowed for Japanese companies to take over the market with cheaper, more reliable alternatives. And the recession and bad exchange rates also hurt Delorean even further. As a result, just a year after the first DMC DeLorean rolled out of the factory line, the DeLorean Motor Company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Unfortunately for John, it was around this time that Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and she wanted to significantly reduce government spending. She immediately seized all government funding of the factory in Northern Ireland and refused to give John any more money to bail the company out. Still, John DeLorean vowed to his team that he would find a way to get the money, but when he said that, nobody could have predicted what he'd do next. A former neighbor of John's, knowing that he needed the money fast, contacted him and told him of a deal that could get him millions of dollars very quickly. The only problem was that the deal involved buying and selling a very large shipment of cocaine. With no other choice, John agreed to this drug smuggling deal, and a meeting was set in a hotel in Los Angeles, near LAX airport. However, this former neighbor of John's was actually setting him up and was secretly working as an FBI informant to try and reduce a prison sentence he'd received. And so, the whole thing was a sting operation by the FBI. And just as they were toasting to the agreement, FBI agents suddenly burst into the room, and John was arrested and charged with conspiracy to obtain and distribute $24 million worth of cocaine. And because the whole thing was a planned setup, they had video evidence of John agreeing to this very illegal deal. John had gone from a popular celebrity at the peak of his career to facing serious jail time. In 1984, after 22 weeks of court proceedings, a surprising verdict was reached. John DeLorean would not be heading to jail, as during his trial, John was able to prove that he was a victim of entrapment. Despite John agreeing to the deal, the jury saw the whole thing as a setup of a desperate man who had been trying to save his car company, and thus, John DeLorean was found not guilty. However, the damage had been done. John DeLorean and his shiny sports car were on the cover of every newspaper and magazine in the country over the scandal. His name became synonymous with sleazy drug deals. However, they do say, any press is good press. And despite John feeling like his car career was over, all the publicity his trial got meant many people heard about the DeLorean car because of it, and they started to see it as a cool car with a cool story because of the scandal John had been involved in. Thus, for a short time, DMC sold more DeLoreans than ever before, but it wasn't enough to keep the factory in Belfast open, so they were forced to shut it down in 1982. Over 1,000 workers were laid off, and in total, only 9,000 DeLoreans were ever actually produced. The DeLorean company was dead. It wasn't until 1985, a whole 3 years after the DeLorean Motor Company fell apart, that the DMC DeLorean became a cultural icon when it became the time machine in the beloved movie Back to the Future. This caused hysteria over the car, and almost every fan of the movie dreamt of having their own DMC DeLorean. And of course, as the movie's popularity grew and it became a whole trilogy, demand for DeLorean cars only grew further. Unfortunately, by the time the movie came out, there were no DeLoreans being sold anywhere. The factory had shut down, and by the time young fans of the movie could afford it, the DeLorean was an antique of yesteryear, a collector's item that is still being sought after to this day. So whilst John's company didn't survive, this trilogy of films helped immortalize DeLorean's beloved car in a way he could never have even dreamed of.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.